All right. So today we have Dave Rossmiller, Dr. Dave Rossmiller, and he's going to be chatting with us about opium addiction. And he has seen some cases, and I'm dying to hear this one. So I'm Kurt Devine, and we have my friend Aaron Foss. You probably all know us already. So do the announcements.
We have some great upcoming echo sessions. Dr. Resnikoff is going to be coming back. He's always amazing. Kurt's going to be doing a great talk on pregnancy and marijuana. And Jessica Oswald is going to be doing a presentation on PrEP, which is I think harm reduction surrounding HIV treatment. And then food addiction is coming up as well. And then also we have other echoes. If you're looking for more content, check out the other echoes listed at the bottom of the screen.
You could spend your whole day watching echoes. Remember, there's free CME. Please send back your thing to Katie and just fill it out. And some of the information we get on there is also great. And again, Dave would love to talk to your face. And at least in my box, I've got my dog as well. They'll be watching. And so please don't feel bad about turning on your video. We don't care if you're eating, drinking, juggling, doesn't matter.
If you have any technical assistance needs, please don't hesitate to reach out. My contact info as well as Kurt's is listed at the bottom of the screen, and we're always here to help with any difficult cases, troubleshooting, anything like that.
And remember, you can go online, the Center for Opioid Resources, got all kinds of stuff on there that you might want to look at before you make your own. So feel free to check that out. And then on to Dave. So we will let Dave share his screen and maybe introduce himself. He's been on the Echo for a long time, and he's making that break into giving a great talk. So.
All righty.
Do you know how to shift into presenter mode? There, you just did it. Perfect.
Okay, I might need help when I have to shift out of it if my link doesn't work. So I'm Dave Rossmiller. I'm a family doc. I've been with Entire Family Clinics for 26 and a half years. We've had 3 different names while I've been there. So we're a clinic system of 10 clinics in the East Metro. And I started doing buprenorphine in 2019, I think it was, 2018, something like that. We had another new graduate who was joining us, and she had her waiver coming out of residency. And I had thought about it, but I kind of didn't want to be the only one doing it. So I thought she might need some backup. And so that's how I got into it. I'm very glad I did. It's one of the most rewarding parts of my practice, I think. And I trained during the pain is the 5th vital sign era. So I kind of felt like I had helped cause some of the mess. I don't think we're the ones driving the mess now, but we helped start it. So it's good to be able to feel like you're helping clean it up some. So that's how I got into getting my waiver and treating this, and really glad I did. And I hadn't had anybody on opium until December last year. And then I had a string of about 4 patients in a short time, which was interesting to me. There's lots of history behind it. And it's just coincidence that all the patients I had were from the Hmong community. It's just the way it worked out. I haven't seen it in any other population groups. So we're gonna go through, do a little history, learn about the history and pharmacology of opium. It's pretty interesting. And then you'll notice some overlap with the talk that Kurt gave on poppy seeds. We're going to learn about treatment options worldwide for opium addiction. So I will be talking about one off-label use for a medication, and then just kind of explore some of the challenges in treating opium addiction with the Hmong community in particular. So case number 1, WX. All these patients were referred to me from our East Side office, which is east side of St. Paul, and has a very heavy Hmong concentration in the clinic. So he's a 78-year-old Hmong male. he had chronic back pain for years, and he'd suffered a back injury during his service in the Vietnam War, which I believe was with the CIA in Laos. And he couldn't specify the exact injury, doesn't qualify for the VA, that kind of thing. So at a visit with his primary on November 2nd, family members told her that he'd been using chronic daily liquid opium for years. And he hadn't been escalating his dose, but he would suffer symptoms if he missed a dose. He'd get sweaty and fatigued. And they did a urine drug screen on him, and that was positive for opiates. So they started him on tramadol 50 milligrams twice a day then, and referred him to me. He had one more visit with, actually a couple more with his primary. With the tramadol, he'd cut back on opium use, but he was still using it daily. He was on the 50 milligrams of tramadol twice a day. And he still had pain, and that's why he was using opium. So they increased the tramadol to 50 milligrams 3 times a day, and then referred him to me for a consult. The provider in this case, she's gotten her training complete now, but she hadn't finished it then, so that's why she referred him. So he had a visit, one more visit. His pain was improved. He wasn't using opium daily, but he still was using it on the tramadol 3 times a day. So the consult was December 1st with me to talk about Suboxone. I remember it was very hectic because I think they each were only scheduled for 15 minutes with me, with an interpreter. So I had gotten a message about them. So I knew somewhat. I didn't really have a chance to review the record extensively, but saw him with the interpreter and his wife. We talked about his history, and he was willing to try some Suboxone. And this is a common story that people start opium when they're in the refugee camp, because it was kind of the only thing available to treat pain. So I did a little quick looking, because I'm like, well, what's the half-life of opium? And it's kind of this gamish of different things. So it's 3 to 10 hours. So between the language barrier and uncertainty of like how long opium would stay in the system, I thought it'd be safer to do a microinduction, less likely to throw them into precipitated withdrawal. So I typically use the 2 milligram, 0.5 milligram films, and I do a quarter of a film once a day for one day, twice a day for the next day, 1 milligram for a day, twice a day for a day, 2 milligrams twice a day for a day, 3 and 4, and then I set him up for a visit. So we did that. His return visit was actually got delayed a little bit. He had some issues getting the prescription, so his start was delayed by a couple days. So it all worked out. And I think he had called, and we'd continued the 4 milligram twice a day dose just over the phone. And he reported rare use of opium, and the buprenorphine was helping with his pain. And when he noticed that when he did use the opium, it didn't have the same effect on him. So we tried increasing him to 8 milligrams twice a day. And then at that point, I had referred him back to his primary because I felt like he was stable enough. He has multiple medical issues, and that clinic is just better set up in terms of interpreters and staff to deal with the complex patients who speak Hmong. So the 8 milligrams twice a day was working well for his pain. He said he had used opium 3 times the past month. He was getting some side effects of dry mouth and difficulty voiding, so they dropped him his dose in the morning to 4 in the morning and 8 at night. Then he had another follow-up on March 1st, and they had also added Tylenol and gabapentin to help with pain. He's having good relief of his pain, hadn't been using any opium. His side effects had improved, and then they were able to bump him back up to 8 milligrams twice a day with good results. So, and there weren't any other follow-ups in his chart when I looked. So that seemed to work out pretty well. So I gotta jump out here for a second. I'm gonna play a video for you. It is from I didn't even know there was such a thing. It's the DEA Museum. And it's a brief video about something that was used by people who were smoking opium in the past, and it goes into a little bit of history. So,
Casey, the museum's historian.
And I'm Emma, the museum technician.
And we're here in the collections facility to introduce this month's featured artifact, an opium pillow.
Every month, we'll take you into the collection and share stories about our most exciting objects. This ceramic pillow transports us to a time when people visited opium dens around the world to smoke the drug.
Opium is a narcotic that comes from poppy plants. It dulls the senses and relieves pain, but is also highly addictive. Opium use spiked in 18th century China when Britain and other Western countries traded the drug.
At that time, opium was grown on plantations in India and exported by European traders, who then sold the drug to people across China. Smoking opium became very popular there, and people of all social classes opened, operated, or visited businesses where they could use the drug.
These opium dens stocked the drug and tools to use it, like pipes. Because opium is a depressant, people who smoke it feel drowsy and prefer a dark place to lie down or recline. Fabric pillows, blankets, and heavy curtains typically fill these comfortable spaces, but customers sometimes use ceramic or wooden pillows like this one to rest their heads.
Chinese craftspeople first made ceramic pillows thousands of years ago. Beautifully decorated pillows date back to China's earliest dynasties and feature culturally significant symbols, poetry, and intricate designs. Many are hollow and have holes so people can store their personal or valuable items inside.
In opium dens, customers would put their valuables inside the pillow, put the side with the opening against a wall, and lay their head against its surface. This posture secured their possessions inside as they used opium. The pillow's exterior was cool to the touch, and it felt refreshing in hot, humid climates.
By the 19th century, opium addiction spread across China as more and more people used the drug. The Chinese government took action when upper-class citizens, leaders, and business owners struggled to perform their duties. Government officials seized and destroyed more than a ton of opium, angering European, especially British traders.
China's attempt to end the opium trade sparked two wars with Britain and other trading nations, the first in 1839 and the second in 1856. The Qing dynasty lost both conflicts and, as a result, lost control over the trade. As Britain and other European countries like France sold more opium around the world, addiction and opium dens spread.
People also brought opium smoking to new places as they traveled. For example, Chinese immigrants came to California in the 1850s to work in gold mines, on railroads, and other growing industries. Some opened opium dens, especially in big cities like San Francisco.
In the United States, smoking opium became widely associated with Chinese immigrants, gamblers, and prostitutes, even though people from all walks of life used the drug and visited opium dens. Communities that feared these groups demanded anti-smoking opium legislation. San Francisco became the first city to make operating or visiting an opium den illegal in 1875.
These laws coincided with growing international efforts to slow the opium trade as addiction spread. China continued to advocate for ending the trade that affected its citizens, but was controlled by Europeans. In 1909, the International Opium Commission convened in Shanghai and recommended that nations regulate opium's manufacture, sale, and distribution, and respect the laws of those nations that prohibited its importation.
In response to the commission, the United States passed the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act in 1909, the first federal ban on any drug. The law prohibited the importation of opium except for medical purposes. Since smoking opium was not used medicinally, the law almost totally banned the drug in the US. Opium dens closed, and decorative ceramic pillows were used less and less.
This opium pillow is only one of over 45,000 artifacts, documents, and videos in the DEA Museum's collection. Each illustrates an important moment in the history of DEA, federal drug law enforcement, and drug use in American culture.
To learn more about DEA's work and other fascinating stories from the collection, follow the museum on Facebook, go to deamuseum.org, or visit the museum in person. Thanks for joining us.
Wow.
Oh, come on.
We're back up.
There we go. Okay. So that was a brief synopsis. I thought that was pretty interesting. For Sherlock Holmes fans, there is one of his stories, The Man with the Twisted Lip. And Watson accidentally stumbles on Sherlock Holmes disguised as an old man singing in an East London opium den. If you guys are Sherlock Holmes fans, he was a cocaine addict, not an opium addict. And Holmes assures Watson that he does not indulge in opium smoking, but only purchase opium as part of an undercover investigation. So there's a rich history surrounding opium. And when you listen to that, it's like, wow, what goes around comes around. And it seems like there are some historical parallels between what happened in China and what's happening now on our southern border. So my wife and I just did a trip to Albuquerque, and if there are any Breaking Bad fans in the room, that was my attempt to, I was feeling uncertain, so I thought I'd try and do a little Heisenberg. But if you've watched the series and you've seen the scenes, granted that was meth, but the scenes of the meth houses and stuff like that really kind of remind me of the opium houses that were happening. So what is opium? Opium is a highly addictive, non-synthetic narcotic. It's extracted from poppy plants, Papaver somniferum. So if you look at somniferum, the word somnolence comes from that. So it induces sleepiness. It's a milky fluid collected from incisions in the unripe seed pod, and then they scrape it by hand and air dry it to produce opium. It's an ancient product. It was cultivated as early as 5000 BC in the Mediterranean area. It can be a solid, a liquid, or a powder, and it can be smoked, taken orally, or injected IV. This is a picture of the Papaver somniferum seed pod, and this actually has a score on it, and that's the sap that's coming out, which makes me think, who on earth thought of this? And it reminds me of the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where Calvin was talking to Hobbes and saying, how did we start drinking milk? Did somebody say, I'm going to walk up, squeeze that thing, and drink whatever comes out? It's just mind-blowing. You know, how did people come up with this thing to do this? Opium, it's got lots of names, also known as Big O, Dopium, Dream Stick, Easing Powder, Hop or Hops, Midnight Oil, which makes me wonder if the 80s band got their name from that, Dope, or relating back to its history in China, Shanghai Sally. And there's tons of other names for it. We talked a little bit about how it's produced. So this is the end product. This is actually legal opium. It belongs to the Mallinckrodt Corporation.
It is.
I don't know if I can see it anymore.
That is the end product.
Yep. That's
Okay, if you're unmuted, please mute.
So this is a whole box of it. They dry it, it turns brown, and then they form it into these cakes. So opium pharmacology. Opium has two main groups of alkaloids. There's the phenanthrenes, and that's things such as morphine, codeine, and thebaine. Thebaine came up in Kurt's talk, in that if you think somebody has a positive drug test from poppy seeds, you can look for thebaine. And those are the main psychoactive constituents. There's another branch called isoquinolones, and that includes papaverin and noscapine, but they don't have any significant central nervous system effects. So importantly, thebaine is the precursor for oxycodone and derivatives like oxymorphone and hydrocodone, hydromorphone, all those. The estimated half-life of opium is 3 to 10 hours, and that's because it would depend a little bit on what kind of mixing of these constituents you have. And the curious thing is, when you try and research opium addiction, everything that comes up is opioids. So what I found was estimated 30 million people worldwide have an opioid addiction, but I couldn't find how many people use opium as their drug of choice. There's classification of opioids by their synthetic process. So the naturally occurring compounds are morphine, codeine, thebaine, and papaverine. The semi-synthetic ones are diamorphine or heroin, and that was synthesized from opium in Germany in the 1800s. Dihydromorphone. Interesting, buprenorphine is a semi-synthetic compound, and then oxycodone. And then you have the synthetic compounds. So the ones I was familiar with, fentanyl and methadone, and then the metabolites of fentanyl. And then the bottom one is the tapentadol, which I know is out and commercially available, but I don't think I've ever used it on anybody. Okay, so this slide got altered. I don't know what happened, but this was the pharmacology of opium. On the left-hand side, kind of in the middle, is papaverine. At the bottom right is noscapine. And then the path that leads to the opioids is the one on the right. And about 2/3 of the way up is thebaine. If you go to the right, it metabolizes the codeine. If you go straight up, it metabolizes the morphine. So very complicated. But this is where the stuff comes from. So where does opium come from, according to the CIA? And actually, I have a contact with the local DEA here. And most of the opium and opioids that are in the US come from Central and South America. The big growing areas for opium are the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. So you can see the Golden Triangle is basically Thailand, which is where a lot of the Hmong were in refugee camps. So you can see how easily available it likely was. My friend with the DEA was saying that they estimate that 20% of Vancouver's economy is actually black market, and that opium and opioids come over our northern border via Vancouver. So I suspect that for these Hmong patients that their opium was not coming from across the southern border, but probably coming through Vancouver and then over the northern border. So there are legal opium medications. The historical name for it is laudanum, but other names for it are paregoric, camphorated tincture of opium, and Donagel. So you might be familiar with it. It's a 10% solution of opium, so it's 10 milligrams per ml. And so 1 ml actually gives you 10 milligrams of anhydrous morphine. And it's used to treat severe diarrhea. My wife is a hospital pharmacist, and I was asking her if they still have it, and she said, yeah, and it gets used somewhat regularly, at least several times a month. The dosing is 0.6 mLs orally up to 4 times a day, which would be a total of 24 milligrams of morphine. It's a Schedule II drug, and I looked on GoodRx, you can get 72 mLs of it, which is a 30-day supply, and it was about $120. It's tricky to use. I have had a couple patients on it in the past. I remember one of them had prostate cancer and radiation. He had a bad radiation proctitis and really bad diarrhea, and this was the only thing that worked. The reason this is tricky to use is it comes with a special syringe that's marked appropriately. And there was one time the pharmacy gave him the wrong syringe, and he inadvertently overdosed and died. So you got to be a little bit careful when you're using this. Other legal opium medications, there's papaverine injection. It's a 30 to 60 milligram intracavernosal injection used to treat erectile dysfunction. Can be used once a day, but not more than 2 days in a row because it can cause priapism. And it takes 1 to 2 minutes to complete the injection. It's a very slow injection. So as you might imagine, that might be part of the reason it didn't really catch on as a treatment for ED. The other legal preparation is B&O suppositories or belladonna and opium. There are two different strengths of that. There's 16.2 and 30, or 16.2 and 60 milligrams. My wife was saying they don't have these right now. There was some production problem, so they haven't had these for a while. But it's one suppository rectally, once a day to twice a day, max of 4 times per day. And it's indicated for moderate to severe ureteral spasm associated pain. I have had patients where urologists have used these, and having had a kidney stone, I could see where you might want to use this, because having a kidney stone was being the analogy I use. It's like in the movie The Princess Bride, when you get hooked up to the machine that sucks the life out of you, that they hook Wesley to. That's what a kidney stone felt like. So you might be willing to use a B&O suppository. So case number 2 was LY. That's the wife of the first person. She's a 77-year-old Hmong female. So she was seen the same day. She has a history of Evans syndrome, which is a warm hemolytic anemia and ITP, and poorly controlled type 2 diabetes. She had been in the hospital and the clinic, multiple workups for pain. And after a while, her family revealed that she had started taking liquid opium about a year prior to the visit. There was a belief in the Hmong community that opium would protect you against COVID. And she had tried to stop on her own, but hadn't been able to due to withdrawal symptoms. And she had been taking a little bit increasing amounts of opium prior to the visit. So started her on the same microinduction, followed up about 2 weeks later, and 2 milligrams of buprenorphine was working well for her twice a day. But she didn't like the bitter orange taste of it. And she'd had some longstanding nausea and vomiting. I couldn't really tell if it was worse and correlated with using the buprenorphine. And she was also having some constipation and was treating that with Magox and Miralax. But we changed it to the plain buprenorphine tablets. I found that sometimes helps with some of those GI side effects. So 2 milligrams twice a day, and trying to decrease her side effects and give her a different flavor. So she followed up with her primary. She had fallen and had some increased pain, but was on the same dose. Another follow-up, pain was well managed, not using opium. She followed up after she'd been in the hospital with low potassium and withdrawal symptoms. And she was referred to a pain clinic at that point. But she was, in general, doing better with the bup and not using opium. And it was increased to 4 milligrams twice a day after her hospital stay. So she had several more follow-ups in her primary's office after she was in with a UTI with sepsis and low potassium and just a complicated patient. But she stayed on the buprenorphine 4 milligrams twice a day, didn't have any cravings for opium. And the last time I reviewed her chart, the pain clinic consult hadn't happened, but kind of thinking it might not need to happen. So that begged the question, does opium prevent or limit COVID? So I was able to find a couple studies. Probably the country where they have the most opium use is Iran. Iran geographically is right next to Afghanistan, so ready access. So they did a cross-sectional study of 513 hospitalized patients in Iran with COVID to see how they did compared to people who were not using opium. And there wasn't a significant difference in the mean days of hospitalization, but the people who were on opium needed ICU admission significantly more often. It was 36% versus 11%. And the mean days of ICU stay was significantly higher in the opium positive group. So like 2 to 6 days versus 1 to 2, something like that. So they came to the conclusion that opium-addict patients with COVID may be more febrile and have more disease-specific symptoms and a more severe disease course. There was another one, this was in the Iranian Journal of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and they did a pilot study in a COVID referral hospital, and it showed the rate of, sorry, I gotta move the bar here so I can read. The rate of opium addiction in 93 hospitalized patients was about 11%, which seemed fairly high. And the calculation of the odds ratio for mortality was 3.6, essentially. And according to their findings, it seemed that the rate of mortality in the opium-addicted population was higher than the normal population. They also commented that of the 6,000 participants from the general population in Iran, in Tehran, the capital, it indicated that 2.4% were addicted to opium. So it seems like it's fairly prevalent there for use. They also showed that the people using opium had higher levels of interleukin-6 in their plasma, which may explain why people got sicker when they got COVID, because they may have been more likely to have a cytokine storm. So the answer to the question is no, it doesn't help. So third case was XC. He's a 53-year-old Hmong male. He presented to his primary on January the 8th and divulged that he'd been smoking opium twice a day for body aches. He had tried to quit once without success, been using it for the past 3 years, and he got referred to me to consider treatment with Suboxone. So his initial visit was January 19th, and he said a friend at work had given him opium, and he was actually smoking it, not taking it orally. So the first people were taking liquid. He was smoking it. He works as a forklift driver in a warehouse, and he hadn't been drug tested at work. So forklift drivers don't need CDLs or commercial driver's licenses, but if there's an accident in the warehouse, they probably will get drug tested. He came in because the opium use was having an impact on his family, and they wanted him to stop. And he tried to stop, but he would get withdrawal symptoms when trying. He hadn't been increasing his dose over time. So he started him on the usual microinduction with Suboxone. And I did a UDS on him. And unfortunately, he had already left by the time I got the results. And he was positive for methadone and opiates. So I'm not sure where the methadone came from. The opiates would come from the opium. So we followed up a week later. He'd worked up to 4 milligrams twice a day of buprenorphine and was too sleepy on that. So he felt like 1 to 2 milligrams twice a day worked well for the achy pain he had and his cravings. And I didn't really delve into what the source of his pain was. Just didn't have time really. He reported that he had used opium once for a headache during that week, but it didn't really help, which is not surprising. So he was going to continue on a 2 milligram dose either once or twice a day. And at that time, his urine drug screen was positive for bup and opiates and also methadone. And actually, I'm going to throw this out as a question. I've had multiple patients in my clinic on bup who on our in-house drug screen, it'll be positive for methadone. And I've sent multiple of them for confirmation it's been negative. And I'm just curious if anybody else has noticed that.
I have never seen that, Dave.
And maybe it's a quirk of our drug test, but it's happened multiple times.
Has anybody else had that? Anybody that wants to comment?
I forgot to look at what brand we use.
Is it just a urine cup or is it going down to lab it's a urine cup?
It's a urine cup.
Okay.
Yeah, we use urine cups as well.
So So
Interesting.
that would explain, that could explain methadone in the second sample, but it wouldn't explain it in the first one. Unless maybe he had gotten buprenorphine from somebody as well. So he followed up on March 1st, and he'd had to spread out his meds. His bottle said there was no refill, so he didn't realize that he could get a refill, but he'd have to call the office. So he claimed to have had enough to spread them out and not use opium, but his drug screen was positive for buprenorphine and opiates. Felt it worked better when taking a 4 milligram dose, because he said, yeah, I did have some cravings on the lower dose. So I kept him on buprenorphine, 4 milligrams twice a day, and I switched him to an 8 milligram film so he could cut that in half. And he had requested refills on April 8th and then on April 30th. And he had a follow-up with me scheduled on June 4th. It got rescheduled to later in the month, and I'm a little worried because he hasn't requested a refill. So see what happens. So this is a little quiz. Will a DOT drug test detect opium? So a DOT drug test, surprisingly, only checks for 5 things: marijuana, cocaine, opiates. So it's morphine and codeine derivatives. So it would detect opium, amphetamines and methamphetamines, and PCP. The curious thing to me is, so yes, it will detect opium, but they don't test for any of the semi-synthetic opioids. So it doesn't detect oxycodone, hydrocodone, and any of their metabolites, and it doesn't detect fentanyl, which I find kind of frightening. That you can have a CDL driver get in an accident, pass an official drug test, and still be impaired by one of these other things. So the last case is, this was probably the case I had the least success with. She's a 66-year-old Hmong female, and she had chronic back pain dating back to when she was in Laos and Thailand. She was a brand new patient to our clinic system at the end of March and had a new primary provider. She'd been on methadone 40 milligrams a day through a methadone clinic, and specifically for opium abuse. And it started that in January of 2024. But she wanted to change because it caused sedation and it was difficult for her to walk when she was taking it. At that visit, they did a urine drug screen and it was positive for opiates and methadone. And they referred her to me to consider buprenorphine. They requested records from the methadone clinic, and they hadn't come by the time I saw her. But I did go through some old records from her prior clinic system, and they did note history of opioid abuse and noted that the patient was evasive when discussing it. So she had a visit with me on April 16th. She had 40 years of opium use, going back to being in a refugee camp in Thailand. She took it for chest and back pain. And according to the patient, she'd had a cardiac workup. It wasn't cardiac in nature. So she tried methadone 40 milligrams per day, but stopped due to sedation. So I had a chance to ask her a little bit how she was using the opium. And she said, well, I take it twice a day, and it's a bigger piece, and I shave off a little piece of it. And she said, it's about the size of a grain of rice. And she would adjust the dose a little bit depending on how she was feeling. So it might be a little bigger, it might be a little smaller. And she said it was the only thing available for pain when she was in the refugee camp, and that's how she started on it. So I started on a micro induction and followed her up a week later. So she had taken 2 days of the microinduction and stopped, and because she was craving opium. And I had told her she could use opium while on the microinduction, but she hadn't. She didn't like taking buprenorphine under her tongue. She denied methadone use and said she had just continued opium twice a day. and her urine drug screen was positive for methadone and opiates, and there wasn't any buprenorphine. And she said that opium relieved her pain for about 10 to 12 hours. She was familiar with what it was like to go through withdrawal and kind of reluctant to continue buprenorphine, but we talked some more. She kind of felt like, I've been taking opium for years and it hasn't been a problem, so why am I doing this? So we talked some more. She had a consistent supply of opium, and if it wasn't available from that person, she had other friends who used opium, and they would direct her to other suppliers. And I asked her, well, how do you know that what you're taking is opium? And she's like, you just know from looking at it, from experience, which I found was kind of interesting. So she was willing to try buprenorphine again. So at that point, I made a decision to have her go into some mild withdrawal and try a higher dose. And I didn't have any follow-up with her. She canceled her next appointment, and she hadn't scheduled with her primary yet. So I'm not quite sure what happened, but that one was not so successful, which made me kind of think, what if she was just on a lower dose of methadone? Might have been an option.
Yeah.
So in researching this, I actually came across a study that looked at different treatment options for opium addiction. And the specific study was looking at risk of sexual dysfunction with the things. But in looking at it, they had standard methadone, or they refer to it as MMT. They had buprenorphine, they called it BMT. But then they treated people with tincture of opium. So this is the off-label use I'm going to talk about. They refer to that as OTT, opioid tincture treatment. And it's actually the third most used method in Iran to treat opium addiction. So Iran has a historically high rate of opium use. And it can be more acceptable to use the tincture of opium. It's a lot less expensive than methadone there. Laudanum has a characteristic odor and it's got a bad taste. So that can limit the tolerance of taking it, both in a good way and a bad way. If you have to convince people to take it, it's not so great, but it probably limits people abusing it because of the bad taste. And it's viewed as kind of, quote, more natural than methadone. They look at it as if you're taking methadone, you're taking a chemical, and if you're taking the tincture of opium, you're taking something natural. So it'd definitely be off-label use in the U.S., but it was interesting to think about, and they found some studies looking at how successful they were. First one was from 2004 in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology. So they were looking at the effectiveness of tincture of opium and methadone to control opioid withdrawal in patients in Thailand. Not quite the best study because they were comparing heroin users and opium users. So the heroin users got methadone and the opium users got tincture of opium. And they tested their blood and then did withdrawal scores and how they were feeling. And basically, what they came away with was tincture of opium was inferior to methadone in suppressing withdrawal, at least in the doses they were using. But it might be worth looking at different sizes and frequency. So that was 2004. This is 2008, same journal. So they were looking at the clinical effectiveness of a dosing regimen where the patient adjusted it, and also the providers adjusted based on how much they reported they were using prior to going into the study. And their conclusion was that adequate suppression of withdrawal can be achieved with minimal side effects in opioid-dependent individuals who are getting the flexible dosing of tincture of opium. And they said it provided preliminary evidence for the effectiveness of tincture of opium in the management of opioid withdrawal. So this was more aimed at opioid withdrawal acutely rather than maintenance. But they had 45 opium-dependent Thai patients, and they got 3 different dosing regimens. So 6, 13, and 20 milligrams of morphine twice a day. 32 people completed the study, and withdrawal scores were low for all of them. And their conclusion was management of opioid withdrawal can be achieved with minimal adverse effects using flexible dosing of tincture of opium. And this was a more recent study in the journal Addiction 2023. So they were testing if opium tincture was non-inferior to methadone in retaining participants in an opioid agonist treatment program in Iran. So it was a double-blind randomized controlled trial, and they were provided treatment and followed for 85 days. So it'd be 12 weeks. It was 204 participants, mostly men, 90% men, in 2017 and 2018. And they were assigned to either tincture of opium or methadone, and using a patient-centered flexible dosing strategy. And the main outcome was whether they kept people in treatment or not. And then secondary outcomes were whether people reported they were using opioids and adverse events. And they said, while this study could not conclude the non-inferiority of opium tincture to methadone, the people taking the tincture of opium, 60% of them stayed till the end of the study, so 85 days. And it was superior to methadone in reducing self-reported opioid use outside of treatment. So there might be something there. I don't know if it would fly in this country, but kudos to people for thinking outside the box. And I wanted to finish up with some of the challenges. If anybody else has treated somebody with opium, or if Charlie's on today, I would love to get some feedback after this. But one of the challenges is definitely language, having to use an interpreter. There's a whole challenge of, even in English, conveying certain concepts and things. And then it depends on how talented the interpreter is. And I'm sure you guys have had the experience of asking a question, having the patient go on a long soliloquy, and then the interpreter saying, no. And you're like, wait a minute, there's more to that answer there than just no. So that using an interpreter is a challenge. There's a cultural challenge. It seems like, at least among the older population, that opium is more acceptable. Because it seemed like a commonality in these cases was the patient didn't seem to have that big a problem with it. It was the other younger family members that were more concerned by it. Legality obviously has something to do with that, but maybe a cultural aspect there. One thing that struck me was the safety. These people have been using opium for 30, 40 years, and they haven't really escalated their dose. They haven't overdosed. You're not going to have people using fentanyl for 30 years have that same track record. There's definitely the denial that, for anybody, it's hard to admit addiction. For these families, a lot of them are unaware of that they were using it for a long time, and then it came to light. Cost. That was one question I forgot to ask, was how much it costs people to use opium, but it may be less expensive than if they're on methadone or buprenorphine or even tincture of opium, $120. I'm not going to be prescribing tincture of opium, but it's a thought. And then the other thing is, is this similar to khat or betel use or even kratom? If you go to Peru and you fly into Cusco, they'll offer you a cup of cocaine tea to help with altitude sickness. So, sort of taken in a cultural context, there's probably worse things in the world than this. So, So those were some of my experiences. I hope you guys learned something, and if anybody else has experience, I'm all ears and love to hear some feedback or questions.
Yeah, it's funny, Dave. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody having an opium patient. I've never seen an arrest like in the news where somebody was caught with opium in Minneapolis.
Well, that's why it struck me to have 4 in a row in such a short time.
Yeah, anybody on the call that's seen it at all?
I'm wondering if it's one of those things like when you're screening patients that you specifically need to ask them about like kratom, or they wouldn't think to associate that.
Yeah, you really do with kratom. You have to say,
Yeah.
oh, kratom, ever use kratom? And it's on our list of on our handouts for patients to fill out before I see them. But
Yeah.
do you have any sense, Dave, whether they cut the opium with anything else? I mean, did you see anything about that?
I don't think so. And just the fact that, people come in and say, oh, I had some pressed perks or something, and their drug screen is positive for, it might be cocaine or amphetamine or things like that.
Yeah.
I think it is relatively pure. I don't think they're cutting it with stuff. Because the drugs, unless they're putting methadone in it, and that's what's causing those positive drug screens.
Yeah, if people have questions, feel free to unmute and interrupt us, because I got like a million thoughts on this. And it's interesting that you were kind of low dosing them, kind of a low date. And if you think about it, first off, when you got the communication barrier and you really don't know how much they're taking, you don't know how potent it is. There's so many variables, right? That makes it really an unknown, like when you start them. Other than getting a cow score if they're sick. Technically they would have morphine and codeine and all the metabolites of all that in there, which typically, would be like if they were taking morphine pills on the street, which we don't see much. But wow. Yeah, I'd have went slow as well.
Part of the reason I did the microinduction is I didn't think I could explain well enough through the interpreter.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go into withdrawal and then start this and take another dose. It just seemed safer to have them do a microinduction. Actually, most of the time now I'm doing microinductions with people.
See, and I'm doing more macros, but I may do a little low dose overnight and then I'll macro them in the morning. But I think in that situation too, when you've got a barrier of language, you want to do the simplest way possible, and that's the way. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, and I'm curious what happened with the last patient when I did try and do more of a macro. I don't think she was that interested in getting off, to be honest. And like the first patient who had been started on tramadol, I kind of wish I would have looked at the chart more. I just didn't have time, but he might have done just fine because tramadol's half-life is fairly short. He might have done just fine on, tramadol 3-4 times a day.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Any sense what kind of people they're buying it from? These aren't the regular people that we're probably seeing patients buy drugs from, I'm guessing. I don't know.
No, I think you have to have a connection.
Yeah.
And just how certain they were when I asked them, well, how do you know that's what you're taking? Oh, you just know.
When you got drug screens, does your drug screen have morphine on it and codeine on it and all those things too?
Our in-house one just has opiates.
Just opiates, okay.
And then oxycodone is a separate one.
Okay. Yeah.
Which makes sense because it's a semi-synthetic.
Yeah. Because that's interesting, because probably on ours it would have popped morphine, probably popped the codeine. But that's just really interesting. Did you get
Tiffany,
any? I'm sorry, go ahead, Aaron. I'm hogging this.
That's okay. Tiffany had put in the chat earlier, Benadryl or allergy meds we found can cause a positive methadone. And I have never heard of that before and thought that was interesting. I'm kind of fascinated by just common ordinary things that can cause positive results.
Yeah,
One of-
Benadryl would be one of those.
In a past life, I reviewed drug tests with the Air Force, and so I did training, and that stuff is fascinating to me. Because there's the different pathways. So if somebody's positive oxycodone, oxymorphone, what are they taking? And
Mhm.
I had one fentanyl positive, and the guy had had a procedure like a day or two before, and they give him that, and then one cocaine, and somebody had had either an ENT or ocular procedure done. So,
Tiffany, did you have a thought? You look like you were contemplating, but you're muted.
I'll have to ask Charlie when he's on again if he's treated anybody for opium.
Yeah, Tiffany, you're muted. Can't figure. All right.
That was super interesting. I love the history.
Yeah, I
know?
think that's just fascinating. Oh, there you go, Tiffany.
Okay. Sorry, I was docked with my laptop and it wasn't letting me unmute there. So I was trying to just undock it. And while I undocked it, I think I don't know what happened, but we just did some research. I don't know, this was probably maybe a month or two ago. And really, when we're talking with getting our presumptive positives back on our mothers, whether they're laboring or postpartum, and they're denying use, it's kind of like, well, why are we seeing positive, methamphetamines and methadones or whatever we might be having? So I was working charge one day and just started to research like what could be causing these things. And I think sometimes when people are talking about their prior to admission medications, they might not think like an allergy pill or a Benadryl here and there for maybe some itching or anything to treat with just those kind of, irritable discomforts of pregnancy. And then I think we also were looking into, because I don't remember if it was a patient diagnosed with schizophrenia or like bipolar, but something showed up wonky in her tox screen too. And we're just like, well, let's look at all of her meds. Like, we're not psych nurses, we're OB nurses. So just like looking at all of that, it was just interesting the amount of everyday drugs that people are taking for either just over the counter or treating whatever other, diagnoses they have were impacting their drug screen. So just totally interesting.
Probably the most common one is Wellbutrin tripping a screen for amphetamine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And amphetamines are by far and away the most often falsely positive test. And because there's just so many things.
Yeah.
So back in the day, Vicks Vapor Rub was L-amphetamine. And so you'd have people who were using amphetamines who would try and cover it up and use a bunch of Vicks Vapor Rub. But you could tell from the ratio of D to L that if they were only using Vapor Rub, it would only be L, and there'd be both D and L. Like, no, sorry.
And they were just throwing it on right under their nose and on their feet, right? That's you put Vapor Rub on your feet. I've had patients do that.
Yeah, it's no longer L-amphetamine. They switched it for something else. But some people stocked up on the old stuff.
Yeah, it's still around. That's great.
It's funny, I take Wellbutrin, and whenever I've had to have a drug screen when I start a new job or something, I always tell the person that. I'm like, hey, just so you know, I might flag. And then I'm like, should I have said that or shouldn't I? I don't really know, but.
Yeah, I'm trying to cover up my methamphetamine and amphetamine use with this Wellbutrin. Yeah. All right. Anybody with other questions before we let Dave go? Yeah, I don't know. You've got 4 and the rest of us all have 0, Dave. So I feel inadequate here that you're just crushing it, and the rest of us have not seen this. So we'll
Well,
have to.
it's Kelly Barnes is at our East Side office, and she's taken these people back once I got them on it. But I'll have to ask her if she started anybody else on it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we again, we thank you for your time, Dave, and it's a great talk. It's like a fascinating issue that I honestly, when you said you had an opioid patient, I was like, no way. And you had 4, I wouldn't even know what to say. So that's pretty amazing. So
Well, I have a feeling it might just be the tip of the iceberg too.
yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, it could be. So, because they all got friends that are using it too. So, all right, everybody. Well, thanks again for coming. I believe next week we have food addiction ? By Essie. She was our fellow at the U in addiction, I believe last year. She's a very fun person. So should be a great talk. So thanks again for everybody for coming.